Good morning, everyone. We're very sorry for what happened last night. We'll see if we can't figure out some way around these problems. In the meantime, we'll fall back on these pre-recorded webinars, which we know does work, and um, try to make it up to you in one way or another. I know Susan's working feverishly on that right now. Let me just start off by explaining the idea behind this series. We have been hearing reports from really right around the country, every part of the country, about the explosion of problems that they're seeing in students. And this is students of all ages, um, teens, primary school students, preschoolers. And there is something different about this. It's not so much that we're seeing new problems as that we're seeing many more kids that are struggling with some sort of, in this series, we'll focus on internalizing, externalizing, and learning problems. Um, but also that the challenges that they're facing are more severe, that they're happening at younger and younger ages, and that they're becoming a little bit intransigent by the time the kid becomes, say, a preteen or a teen. So we began to research this as carefully as we could. We had our team looking into this. And this idea for an epidemic of epidemic series is based on articles that we found where the various things that we're going to be looking at were referred to as an epidemic. Um, I use that term with some caution. It has a very dramatic impact, a bit of a shock value. Um, but at this point, our data is relatively scarce. So, whether we're really seeing an epidemic or simply, we've become much more aware of the extent of these problems, or that the problems are themselves, as I mentioned, becoming more serious. The reality is this. The reality is that it's becoming harder on teachers. And this use of the term epidemic is really a reflection of the increased stress on teachers or on parents. So what we've done is we have tried to settle on the 10 most obvious examples, but I should emphasize right at the start that in fact the term epidemic has been used, roughly speaking, for about two dozen different things. So right across the board, we are seeing a growing number of challenges that young people are facing growing up. And our belief, of course, is that these are all fundamentally interrelated, and that self-regulation is a pivotal factor linking all of these various challenges. This is a point that Fraser and I looked at in some detail in early years study 2, trying to explain why a common pathway can result in more than one problem at different points in the lifespan. So I'll refer you both to Calm, Alert, and Learning, where I talk about this, and to Early Years Study 2, where Fraser and I looked at it and tried to summarize what data we had in 2005, 2006. But for today, we'll focus on the anxiety epidemic. And this is perhaps the issue that's receiving the most attention these days, partly because of the reasons I've given, partly because it's not simply so many young people are struggling with anxiety, but the fact that we're seeing this now appearing in even very young children. And um, it's clear that something is going on and that we have an opportunity, and in fact, I would argue you know, a necessity to figure out how we can address this within a school setting, within a classroom. So let's start off by looking at the epidemic itself. Um, the um, fact that the fact that this is so resistant to various kinds of treatment, both therapeutic, both talk therapies and in fact medical interventions, um, has really focused our attention on understanding and addressing the roots of this problem. So that's what we're after here. What we're after here is understanding why this is happening, and our goal, of course, in understanding why, is to uh, really address and help the child address the underlying causes before these do become intransigent, before they do become entrenched. So the first question is, how big is the problem? And here, as I mentioned, we have limited data. One of the most important sources that we have is this TDSB study, and this is now well known. There are obvious limitations in this study. The fact is that it's a self-report study, and that means that um, we always have to uh, interpret this kind of data with a certain amount of caution. Um, in this case, the people who designed the study um, inserted what are called lie detectors, and those are really uh, different ways of asking the same question in order to try to reduce, um, the effect of kids just saying what, perhaps is uh, a very popular theme today without really understanding it. And the result of what was in fact a very carefully designed study is obviously worrying. And there's the summary of the data in front of you. And this is telling us that an awful lot of kids are experiencing a stress overload. We don't know why. We don't know what that means. We don't know what the stress is. But that's what this slide is telling us. And in fact, the problem is probably more significant than this data reports, because there will be an awful lot of kids that are in fact struggling with anxiety but don't know it. May think that they're they've got, say, some sort of undiagnosed stomach problem, or that they can't get over the flu. They've had it for months and months and months. And, part of our mental health efforts in the country now are educating the public, educating parents, and educating teachers about the nature of anxiety, so that this information can be disseminated, so that kids can recognize the signs. So that's very much what we wanted to start off with here as well. And it's by no means a straightforward matter to clarify the nature of anxiety. In fact, um, this is more of an umbrella term, what's called a family resemblance term. There are many different kinds of anxiety, and they all get grouped together. And we can have various experts talking about anxiety, and it's not entirely clear that they're talking about the same thing. So, roughly speaking, what I've done here is I have tried to identify 4 of the major clusters that we associate with chronic anxiety. So here what we're talking about is, not say, uh, episodic episodes of anxiety. For example, the anxiety of performance before, giving a speech or playing in a big hockey game. We're really looking here at that sort of underlying state that persists for a fairly long time. And that, of course, is one of the big distinctions that we make when we do distinguish between a state or a mood and an emotion, whereas emotions are fleeting, um, moods are sustained over time. And in this case, we can uh, use these four clusters as a way of sort of organizing everyone's thought about, what is distinctive about anxiety. So we've got these four. The first one, this idea of undirected fear, that's a very important point, because when we talk about the emotion of fear, we really uh, think of fear as having something that you are afraid of, an object of the fear. And so you can identify what it is that you're afraid of, the person, the event, whatever. But with anxiety, there you can have these feelings of fearfulness without necessarily being able to identify what it is that you're afraid of. And one of the traits of the human mind is that in this state, we will find something in the state of anxiety, our mind will find something to be afraid of. But typically what happens is that you sort of bounce from one thing to another. And of course, that's what we mean when we talk about monkey mind. This constant state of worrying about something. And we will find something to worry about or to be frightened about. Invariably, this will happen, when we wake up in the middle of the night. The physical symptoms associated with anxiety are an extremely important aspect of it. Um, if you think about the kinds of shifts that are going on in self-regulation, the the metabolic functions that are suspended or suppressed when we are in this state of fear, we can begin to understand why we would see these various symptoms. Um, and it would really be a separate lecture to explain, what's really going on with these various, why you might have, the chest pain or the stomach pain, how that relates to the kinds of changes that occur in breathing or in digestion under fight or flight. But for our purposes today, really what we want to focus on is that quite often uh, a child or the child's parents may only be aware of that of this physical uh, dimension of anxiety, and so unfortunately, um, without understanding these as signs or symptoms of anxiety, they may try to suppress these problems, say with over-the-counter medications. And the problem with that is, of course, that you've done nothing to address and therefore ameliorate the underlying causes of those physical problems. The underlying causes being the excessive stress load that the child has. Then there are the psychological symptoms, and those, of course, are the most well known. And typically the primary symptoms that we use to diagnose chronic anxiety. And then finally, a very important aspect of anxiety, of chronic anxiety, is the negative bias. So by negative bias, what we mean is that the child's perceptions become very negative, become very self-fulfilling. So everything is seen in fairly bleak or black terms, including how the child sees their own self-worth, their own abilities. And what happens is, as we'll come back to in a couple of minutes, the child tends to become, uh, sort of caught up in this escalating cycle of all four domains, where uh, the more negative the child is, the more anxious the child becomes. So the more negative the child becomes, and so on and so on. So the most important question for us as educators is, why is this becoming so pervasive? I mean, that's the point of having a webinar on anxiety as a an epidemic. And so, really, what we want to know is, um, why are so many kids beginning to struggle with much more than the sort of episodic anxiety that we typically saw at transition points in education, grade transitions. So there are many, many different sources of the stresses that kids are under. And this is by no means, this slide that's up is by no means meant to be exhaustive, but rather to give us some idea of what is a generation with heightened stress. And I'll just mention a couple of these here. Um, if you look at this carefully, it really um, encompasses both psychosocial stresses and environmental stresses. So, for the psychosocial stresses, we might be looking at, say, that bottom left, the overly competitive age, and now just about every aspect of a kid's life is competitive, and to some extent, including how they look or how many likes they get on Facebook or whatever, or how they do in school, how they do in sports. It's a very competitive age, and of course, it affects their parents too. And when we look at parental anxiety, we aren't simply, obviously, we're not simply concerned with their anxiety about their kids, but their own anxiety, uh, the complexity of modern life, the challenges of modern life, which has a huge impact on parenting, on family dynamics, and we can broaden from these sort of psychosocial stresses into some of the environmental stresses that we face. And uh, there have been, as I'll come back to if we have time, there have been now quite a few studies showing us that urbanization, which is, the primary defining feature of modern life, pretty much in all developed in all developed societies, um, that urbanization does bring with it uh, all kinds of physical stresses as well as social. So, simply the stress of getting to work, of commuting, or the stress of crowds, or the stress of pollution, noise levels, lighting levels. All of these are physiological stresses. And I'll just mention briefly the top three. And um, first with mismatch theory. So this is Sir Peter Gluckman's theory. And it's a very important argument. Quite a few uh, um, anthropologists now have picked up on these ideas, and we're really trying to look at a biology that was fashioned, that was shaped in the Pleistocene, and the kinds of stresses that occur um, in a modern life because of a dramatically different kind of lifestyle, dramatically different kind of environments. So, an obvious example would be exercise. We have a physiology that was clearly designed for so much more activity than a child typically gets today. And the magic number usually given is 10,000 steps. That was based on a study that was originally done back in the middle 70s. I believe it was done in Japan. I haven't got the data here, but it's become a fairly standard way of talking about the average number of steps that we need to take in a day. And the thinking behind this is that uh, this kind of exercise um, produces all kinds of metabolic effects, where on the one hand it is essential for removing toxins from the body, and on the other hand for producing beneficial neurochemicals, neuropeptides. And of course, there are all the aspects of the soothing aspects of, say, walking, especially walking through nature. And we have so much research over the last few years on the importance of experiences in nature, something called biophilia, um, that our nervous system um, is so heavily dependent on being in nature to have various soothing or restorative functions triggered. So when we're looking at stress, we're really using that five domain model that is at the heart of calm, alert, and learning, and at the heart of Self-Reg. Um, and the point here is that we never want to simply look at psychosocial stresses, that we really look at stress from the Walter Cannon-Henselier perspective of anything that requires the expenditure of energy to maintain homeostasis, to maintain balance. And so what anxiety is telling us, when we see anxiety, it's telling us that that homeostatic system is out of balance, that the stress load has tipped the system in such a way that it's finding it difficult to get back to sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. And finally, we just have to acknowledge the possibility of a contagion effect. We see contagion effects when we look at, when cultural psychiatrists look at how uh, certain emotions proliferate in societies, different emotions. So, the classic example given was the phenomenon of running amok in um, uh, Java and those Pacific societies. And so it has in fact been shown that at different times, different societies um, see this sort of uh, predominance of a particular emotion, and it is quite possible that what we're seeing here is a similar contagion effect in our society, where anxiety is becoming, it breeds itself. If I am uh, exposed to someone who is highly anxious for reasons that I'll try to go into in a second, it can trigger anxiety in me, um, and this has nothing to do with a sort of predisposition or um, a cognitive weakness. These are really subcortical functions that are triggered, that explain why we see this very rapid spread of some sort of in this case an internalizing problem. Um, the effects are, of course, very serious, and the effects are uh, long term. And really, what we're looking at here are how the various you know, downstream consequences of chronic anxiety um, will impinge not just on, say, learning and educational outcomes, but also on well-being and on physical health. So um, there, you know, the HPA pathway hypothesis that Fraser and I were working on really suggests that um, the costs on the nervous system build up, and they build up over time and um, affect all aspects of, you know, our social well-being, our social relations, our pro-social behaviors, and so on. So, in general, we summarize this now as, you know, the big effect is this sort of uh, uh, very difficult to reverse shift from learning brain to survival brain. And I am assuming for this webinar that you have some familiarity with these concepts. If not, they are explained in Cal. And we do have other materials on TMC website to help you. Um, but for the purposes of today, we just want to assume that we understand that what's going on when you have this shift from learning brain to survival brain is not simply that you know, the student's ability to learn or the student's ability to process information is constrained, but that in survival brain, the kid is really expending enormous amounts of energy, being constantly on, you know, heightened alert, and that um, in this state is the student is much more vulnerable to having his or her alarm triggered, his you know, his subcortical, his limbic system alarm going off, and so constantly slipping into fight or flight, and with all of the attendant behavioral problems that we see. You know, the problems in the explosive behaviors or heightened impulsivity and so on. So really what we're uh, what we're looking at in this webinar is why are we seeing, you know, in this sort of societal level, so many kids that are getting stuck in survival brain, which is going to have this effect that's in the second bullet. Um, and then, you know, if we can figure that one out, then we're going to then what we're going to do is we're going to um, look at, and this is what we do in Self-Reg, we'll look at the ways that we can reduce the stresses in, you know, our classroom environment, our teaching style, in order to facilitate that shift back to learning brain. But of course, the point of Self-Reg is that the student himself or herself has to be, absolutely has to be engaged as part of the process of making this shift back into learning brain without realizing that this has happened to them, without even being aware that 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 their brain has undergone this shift. All they're aware of is one or more of those four domains of anxiety that we looked at a few seconds ago. Um, so what we have to do is we have to, you know, through Self-Reg, really what we're doing is a new form of education where we're understanding why, why have I become so locked into this chronic state of anxiety. So I won't spend any time on this. I wanted to just very, very quickly, I mean, this is obviously the core of this picture of the triune brain is the core of Self-Reg. Um, and really what I wanted to, all I wanted to mention here was the kind of shift that we're after here. You know, when we were running Mary, Jim Stevens showed me he had these wonderful uh, um, images of what a brain looks like when it's in survival brain and what a brain looks like when it's in learning brain. And in that case, we have blues and reds. And what really happens is that in survival brain, the intensity of the processes going on in the blue brain, the prefrontal or the neocortex, are significantly muted. And the processes in the green brain are really quite dominant. And this shows up in the green brain we get in those parts of um, uh, the Paralimbic, it's called, the Paralimbic system, connected to them. They are really uh, dominating what's going on in the brain. High, so very strong red images. And so what's happening is in the shift from learning brain to survival brain, it's really that green brain that's running the show. And the blue brain is kind of yoked to what's happening. So that's what we want to reverse. What we want to do is quieten down the green brain so that the blue brain can, um, become, again, much more capable of doing things like thinking, reappraising or appraising situations, planning, listening, paying attention. Um, but these, but in order for that to be possible, we have to figure out how to turn off that survival brain functioning, how to reduce the arousal of the green brain. So that's what we're after here. And in essence, this is, it's the crux of the self-reg view of what anxiety is all about. So what it's about is chronic limbic arousal, a limbic system that has become kindled. And what we mean by kindled is that as a result of an excessive stress load, the the limbic system's alarm, the amygdala alarm, becomes it's so much more easily triggered. The slightest thing can set it off, and I often talk about this as being like a car alarm that's been kindled would be a car alarm where a leaf lands on the hood of the car and the alarm goes off. So what we have to do is we have to, in order to turn off a kindled alarm, what we have to do is we have to reduce the stress. But the problem for the big problem with chronic anxiety is that, that's easier said than done. Like you might say, well, maybe what I need to do then is have my student do 10 minutes every single day of meditation, and that will counteract this kindled alarm. And there are numerous problems with that, and we'll look at these problems in a separate webinar. But essentially, for the moment, um, uh, there's the obvious point that for some kids, this experience, like say forcing them to do meditation, is in fact a further stressor. They're not at that point, or there are various things about their physiology or their psychology that makes this not an effective way of reducing stress. But there's a deeper problem that I wanted to look at for this opening webinar, and that's the fact that the kid in chronic anxiety, the student has become caught in a stress cycle. So this is, here I have just a 4-part stress cycle, and the idea behind the stress cycle is that these stressors impinge on each other, that they have a sort of multiplier effect. And think of it as being like the electrons in in a bell jar, and if we add a catalyst so the electrons start to bounce against each other, well, what's happening in this stress cycle is that each of these four domains represents different kinds of stress. So in the physical domain, I've given a closer example here. So here I'm trying to explain what some of the more prominent signs of stresses in those four domains. I've left out in this the prosocial domain because of the complications that introduces. We will look at that in the next webinar. So if we go down to the bottom of the stress cycle, so in the physical, what we know is that when a child or teen is in a chronic state of low energy and high tension, that makes them very vulnerable. It raises the stressfulness, if you like, of stresses from the other domains. So let's say that that the student is in this state of low energy and high tension, and that of course is again something that I've explained in Cal. This comes from Robert Thayer's energy tension matrix. So now what happens is that student is much more vulnerable to emotional stresses, to these strong negative emotions. So then the next step is that makes them more vulnerable to cognitive stresses, to disturbing thoughts, worries, intrusive thoughts. All of this has a dramatic impact on their social behavior, on how well they can read social cues or recognize the effect of their behaviors on others, or resolve interpersonal conflicts. And so that in turn, so now what's happening is these accumulating, these multiplying stresses further add to the drop in energy and the increase in tension, because of course this is the key to stress, to what stress does. And so you can see now how the cycle can simply maintain itself, that it becomes very difficult when a student is caught in one of these cycles to break out of it. And there's another point that's an incredibly important aspect of all of this, and that is that the cycle can be triggered at any node. So in fact, it could be that it's a strong emotional stress, fear, whatever, that triggers the cycle. Or it could be it could be a social problem that triggers it. It doesn't have to, the cycle can be triggered at any point, but once triggered, it becomes increasingly difficult for the child or teen to break out of it. So that becomes, our entry point in Self-Reg. What we want to do is we want to break the cycle. We need to figure out how we can interrupt this this escalating effect of stresses bouncing on stresses. So to do this, we keep on emphasizing over and over that we don't want Self-Reg to be seen as another program. And at Mary, we looked at doing this as a form of, constant hypothesis testing. We know that this mood disorder is the result of excessive stress. What we don't know is what the stresses are, nor do we know what for an individual child is going to be an effective regulating activity or practice. So, we're constantly discovering what the stresses are and how we can return to that state of being calmly focused and alert. And it's clear that, first of all, I mean, it's obvious that the student has to be the primary um, agent in this process. But what's fascinating is that even very young kids can do this. Even very young kids, once they begin to understand this, and we have to explain these ideas in terms that are age relevant or developmentally relevant, that they can begin to figure this out for themselves. And so, what we have to recognize, and this is huge, is that what we're not trying to do is we are not trying to suppress these problems. In behavior management, what we're really trying to do is, you know, um, control what the child is doing and get them to learn how to control themselves. But that's not what we're doing in Self-Reg. What we're doing in Self-Reg is trying to ameliorate the conditions that made control such a major issue. We want to look at identifying, reducing the stresses that have brought about these problems in the first place. So we can help in a huge way by helping our students understand what the major stressors are in their lives. And our big concern when we're doing, our big concern for a series like an Epidemic of Epidemics series is that clearly we are dealing with quite a large number of hidden stresses. In other words, there are all kinds of things that are stressing the autonomic nervous system that we do not look at as a stress. So some of these are clear, right? Some of these, if you mention to anyone lack of sleep as a major stressor, then yeah, well, we get that. But there are aspects of sleep, there are hidden stressors that are affecting sleep that we don't immediately recognize. So in one of my blogs from a couple of months ago, I was talking about this big Swedish study that was done that found that quality of sleep is profoundly impacted by violent video games. And really what's happening there is that in the violent video game, the limbic system is put on high alert. And it takes, because that's what the limbic system is doing. It doesn't recognize that it's playing a game. That's the job of the blue brain, of the neocortex or the prefrontal. But of course, the prefrontal has been suspended as the limbic system is constantly going into fight or flight because of the imaginary, either someone trying to kill you or you're trying to kill. And the problem is that the limbic system alarm takes quite a long time to turn off. So even if you turn off the violent video game at 10 p.m. or the kid falls asleep from sheer exhaustion, that limbic system stays on high alert for quite a long time. And so now what's happening is that even though the child is asleep, um, they are still burning enormous amounts of energy, in heightened tension, in elevated heart rate, in elevated breathing, respiration, because of this limbic alarm that hasn't turned off, even though the kid's asleep. So this is a case of a hidden stressor, and it's a very interesting case. It's more than interesting. It's a huge case when we stop to think about the number of our kids that are doing just this before they go to sleep. So when we look at all of the we've only given you 9 here of the major stressors, and we can certainly add to this. But what we want to do for each of these 9 is we want to uh, distinguish very carefully between, the sort of overt stresses, the ones we can easily um, identify as a stress, but also we need to be very mindful now, given the seriousness of this issue, of the hidden stressors in each of these. What are the aspects of these that are uh, having the effect on the brain that it is finding it very difficult to switch from survival brain back to learning brain? Um, so what I'll do is I've already gone over my time, as we suspected might be the case. So I will give Susan this PowerPoint so you can see what we've done. What I've done here is I've just uh, tried to give you some leads on how we can start to uh, break down these major stressors, the kinds of research that we do have to draw upon that helps us understand the overall effect of a generation whose stress, in the sense of the energy costs, is beyond what their system can recover from, and hence we see the anxiety. Hence we see the anxiety now becomes this invaluable sign that we have that this system has been stressed to the point where it is now finding it very difficult to recover back to that sort of homeostatic balance, where calmness and alertness are the signs of homeostatic balance, where the sympathetic and parasympathetic are both in balance again. Now we have some wonderful treatments. We have some wonderful methods of of dealing with anxiety, and by no means is Self-Reg intended as um, you know an attempt, yet another treatment. It is not. And this brings us back to the point about Self-Reg being a process and not a program. Um, it's up to the individual family or the individual child um, to find that if they need treatment, which works for them. But what we do find is that all of these, any kind of treatment, any kind of school-based approach to this problem, has to be grounded in self-reg, because until we can get that sort of energy balance restored, until we can turn off the alarm and facilitate this shift from survival brain back to learning brain, um, that the effectiveness of the various treatments is limited, simply because the child finds it so difficult either to process the things that we're trying to explain or trying to teach, or to exercise those skills when they are in that survival brain state. So we come back, and we will, in each of these webinars, we come back to the 5 steps of self-reg. But here, the point I wanted to emphasize is that, we typically think of self-reg as something that, either the teacher has to do or the parent has to do. So it's the teacher or the parent that has to reframe the behavior to distinguish, for example, between misbehavior and stress behavior. But for something like the anxiety epidemic, um, it's the student himself or herself that has to do this as well. They have to recognize the significance of these signs, the feelings. If we go back to that first early slide of the 4 domains of anxiety, they have to read those as signs that they are in a state of excessive stress, and then they have to figure out what those stressors are and how to reduce them. Now, to take a very simple example, suppose it is the suppose that we're dealing with a kid who really where the primary source of the stress in the child's life is, say, the violent video game or the social media. Um, we can't police this. We will not affect change in that student's life by some sort of punishment and reward approach. They have to become the agent of this change. So they have to be the one that recognizes that these symptoms that they have, physical, psychological, emotional, the bias, these are the signs. This anxiety is a sign of their excessive stress, and they have to be the ones that figure out what those stressors are and how to reduce them. They have to be the ones then um, who will seek out um, not just ways of reducing the stress in their lives, but seek out those activities that, if we go back to Gluckman, to the mismatch theory, that we know promote this overall well-being that Fraser and I talked about. They have to um, experience for themselves the effects of being calmly focused and alert. So they have to read those signs as well. And what we find is, we've done this now, we've done this right across the country. And what we have seen is that if we are patient and we support this learning process, um, that every student can do this. And some do it very quickly. Some may take several months before they start to they start to internalize these lessons. But they all do it. And finally, what we have learned over and over is that we as educators have to do it for ourselves. Because if we are witnessing an anxiety epidemic in our students, then it doesn't take too much reflection to recognize the impact this is having on us as educators. Um, if there's a contagion effect from student to student, there's also a contagion effect from student to teacher. So we have to do this for them. We have to do it for ourselves. And what we have found, we probably need another graphic here, but what we have found is a sort of Yuri Bronfenbrenner type ecological model where, if we picture a school as this sort of closed environment, student, teacher, administrator, parent, um, that the directions of Self-Reg have to be bottom up and top down. Everyone has to be engaged in this process. And the result is phenomenal. The result is that not only do we begin to understand why this is happening, but as a result of understanding why, we really do learn what. We learn what we need to do to break the cycle for a particular student, break the cycle for a particular class, break the cycle for a particular school. So we will invite you all now. Our original intention had been to have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So now what we'll do until we've got our technology sorted out is if you could send us in questions, and I promise we will address each and every one of them. Thanks, everyone.